In 1647, the inhabitants of the county and city of York petitioned the Lords and Commons, now assembled in Parliament, for permission to create a university for the education of scholars in arts, tongues, and all other learning. Being inhabitants of the northern parts, York was looked upon as a rude and almost barbarous people. The creation of a university would be a special means of washing from us the stain of rudeness and incivility, and the rendering of us not much inferior to others in religion and conversation. York citizens also had a few warnings about the consequences of a want of scholars, which seem very timely today. I want to start my contribution to the HRC's 10th anniversary provocations with this ultimately unsuccessful petition, not because I want to argue that it is only thanks to the HRC that the stain of incivility has been washed from the city of York, but rather by arguing as an archaeologist that the HRC sits within an intellectual tradition that has been shaped from the 7th and 8th century onwards by a distinctive relationship between people, places, and things. In particular, I want to pinpoint a few moments in history when the city both provided the space for, but also became the subject of, critical inquiry, creating a place that has become an intellectual as well as a physical home to many of us down the centuries. To this end, my provocation is not an individual one, but rather, in true HRC fashion, an acknowledgement of the work of colleagues, former students, and current students, and I'm grateful to everyone who has shared their work with me in advance of today's session. So I'll start, not surprisingly, in the 8th century with Alcuin, the most learned man anywhere to be found, according to Einhardt's Life of Charlemagne. What set Alcuin's cathedral school apart was his vision for the capaciousness of the humanities, an approach to widening participation, which I'm sure our new VC would appreciate. His curriculum was one of the broadest in the West, not just grammar, logic, rhetoric, arithmetic, music, astronomy, and geometry, but also history and natural history. For Alcuin, learning was not just designed to teach you how to save your soul or those of others, or how to run the kingdom. It was an intrinsic good, a delight, a recreation, to be valued for its own sake. Through his writings, we get an insight into his library of treasured books inherited from his tutor, together with a dialogic mode of teaching in which inquiry, discussion, and conversation was encouraged and knowledge shared, not locked away. Alcuin's time in York exposed him to a centre of international trade, a crossroads for Frisian and Irish merchants, bringing exotic goods and new ideas to the city, and preparing him to rub shoulders with the great and good of medieval Europe, and become a firm favourite in Charlemagne's court. Now, Alcuin's intellectual legacy and his library might have been lost when some rather rowdy Scandinavians rode down the River Ouse, but I'm sure my Viking and indeed Norman colleagues would want me to argue that new forms of cultural exchange, language, poetry, and sculpture did emerge from these initially slightly bruising encounters with European integration. By the late Middle Ages, York, of course, had re-emerged as England's second city, and the physical legacy of this great centre of artistic production and cultural creativity remains with us today. Nowhere is this more apparent than the Minster, with its great east window re-revealed by partnerships between colleagues at the university here, the Glaziers Trust, York Minster, and its Stoneyard. Here, York is at the cutting edge of research, attracting students once again from across the globe to study in this living laboratory for conservation and heritage science. Behind the walls of the Borthwick and the City Archives, of course, also lie unique collections of civic and ecclesiastical records. Painstaking research by colleagues here has revealed their potential to shed new light on the origins of the city after the Norman conquest and the emergence of new forms of political and civic discourse, especially in one of my beloved guild halls. And new forms of digital humanities collaboration are showing how techniques of digitization and open access are democratizing access to the humanities through archival projects such as the Archbishop's Registers and the Northern Way project. And again, our former Dean, Mark Ormrod, was very much involved in both those projects. The medieval city was one in which all sections of the community were bound together in creative, artistic and dramatic co-production, with research on the mystery plays and medieval music feeding into new interpretive performances, such as Ambrose's Guildhall-inspired composition. Again, another Guildhall, they're always at the centre of things. Or extending to the regions, former Dean Judith Buchanan's silent Shakespeare project, taking Richard III back into the ambience of Middleham Castle. One of the most satisfying examples for my own work has been the York Curiosa project, where student research on the historic buildings and spaces of York was pitched to a group of artists funded by the Arts Council and then informed the creation of new interventions in the cityscape. And again, just a few examples of that. The Red Tower project, Heinrich and Palmer's wonderful installation recreating the flooding of the King's Fish Pool and opening that building up now to permanent community use. And Damien's wonderful project, Listening to the City, a collaboration with poet John Wedgwood Clark, graffitiing poems on the walls of the Snickelway in the city. Now, York's appreciation of its past and the value of studying it has encountered challenges. The Civil War saw the city bombarded and St Mary's Tower blown up by the parliamentarian forces led by Thomas Fairfax. But as a son of York, Fairfax sought to preserve its archives and, of course, its stained glass, rescuing from St Mary's Tower the monastic collections of the antiquarian Roger Dodsworth, who himself had gathered these precious remains of antiquity from the dark recesses where they were buried and spent 30 years in this commendable employment. No ref pressure there. His volume was finally brought to publication several decades later, of course, in Dugdale's Monasticum Anglicanum. Indeed, despite its 1647 petition for a university, the late 17th century corporation seemed rather unconvinced of the value of antiquarian publication. In 1662, when the Recorder of York, Thomas Widrington, offered his rather rambling History Analecta Eboricensia of the city to its aldermen in lieu of the customary financial gift, he got short shrift. I won't attempt a Yorkshire accent. A good purse, they said, is more useful to us than a long story. But 15 years later, York gained an antiquarian who set a new tone for scholarly inquiry. James Torr, whose image on the left you see here, was a remarkable figure whose meticulous recording of the Minster, parish churches, tombs and furnishings laid the foundations of an antiquarian industry in York, as Louise Hampson has argued. The late 17th and early 18th centuries saw the emergence also of the York Virtuosi, the glass painter Henry Giles, no relation, topographical artist Francis Place, resident of King's Manor, clergyman Miles Gale and the antiquarian Ralph Thoresby, as well as the physician and zoologist Dr. Martin Lister, vice president of the Royal Society. These men also took inspiration from the city, recording its antiquities, as we see here in the example of Place and Lister, and establishing cabinets of curiosities and collections that allowed them to contribute to the highest levels of contemporary scholarly debate and discussion. Alongside this, York began to be aware that the city's antiquities had a broader appeal to a wider public. In the mid-18th century, the self-styled antiquarian and publisher Thomas Gent published what was effectively the first tourist guide to the glass of York Minster. And I know many of you will want to go outside and look at the English department's wonderful thin ice press, taking inspiration from Gent's entrepreneurial establishment of a printing press on the surface of the ice on the River Ouse in the mid-18th century, printing special versions of accounts of your presence on the Ouse that day. And that legacy now has been reignited for current students, preserving the legacy of the print trade in York. But York's distinctive offering as a city of culture and leisure, which found expression in the creation of the assembly rooms and the New Walk Terrace, is also something that continues to attract colleagues from 18th century studies, students and tourists to the city, well, most of them anyway. By the 19th century then, York had become a city of conversible sociability, And once again, it was a combination of interests in the region's natural history, the excavation of the Kirkdale Caves, and the city's antiquities, the excavation of St Mary's Abbey, which contributed to the foundation in 1822 of the Yorkshire Philosophical Society. The society, with its mix of artists and architects, Ridsdale Tate, James Atkinson, Canon William Vernon Harcourt, founder of the British Association for the Advancement of Science, believed profoundly in the connection between the arts and the sciences, and that the study of the past could yield answers to contemporary questions and future discoveries. This tradition of interdisciplinary study, open to the sciences, social sciences, as well as the humanities, is one which the HRC has actively promoted through its proposition and lightning rod sessions, through its hosting of new multidisciplinary endeavours, such as the Centre for the Anthropocene, and through its emphasis throughout on the humanity in the humanities. For the HRC was founded by Professor Jane Moody. I think she's just sitting over there, and developed after her untimely death by Professor Judith Buchanan, with a profound belief in people at its core. Both understood York's legacy that in order to create the space for a flourishing intellectual community, you needed to create a physical space that acted as a source of inspiration and delight. And both understood that such a community was not just composed of academics, but of students and of research and administrative support staff, with a shared vision of and commitment to the relevance, reach, and value of the humanities to society. This is the legacy we're here to celebrate. Here's to the next 10 years and lots more cake.
Hello. Well, first of all, thank you for that very elegant presentation. I thought it was good. It did provoke me in a positive way to ask one question. You hinted in the sort of survey of the sort of earlier context for humanities and York as a place, as a city, that there, as it were, that's not an inward-looking connection, but an outward-looking one. I just wonder if you could reflect on how, in a time when we seek to decolonize our approaches to city, community, humanities as a field of endeavour, we could think about more recent connections of York with the wider world. And I'll just throw out two to think about. One is the arrival of the railways in the 19th century, involving the arrival of a large Irish community who had their achievements and their problems, and that's a story for historians, and I think also for probably people interested in culture. And then the emergence of chocolate production with its relationship to an imperial world of cocoa production, colonial endeavour, and so on, which one of our graduates, Emma Roberts, of course, did a most wonderful book on.
Thank you, Joanna. Yes, you can imagine it's very hard to leave things out of a presentation. And I think that certainly, if I could take your first point, the railways, what a fascinating legacy for us to unpack in the city. In the one sense, of course, York's lack of a major industrial revolution is one of the reasons why we have so much of the city surviving. And sometimes we might look with envy to our colleagues, down the road in South Yorkshire or West Yorkshire. On the other hand, of course, we're very different because of that. And yet, of course, that the railways, we're a pioneering centre for engineering and revolution in that sense. Very interesting to see the recent award of major funding to the National Railway Museum. And given the strength of their application to the lottery, disappointing that they didn't get that, but of course the North York Moors Railways did. So actually now that we've got two of those railway museums with major amounts of funding, I would hope that there's real capacity there for us to build on the very important strengths from the History Department with the Centre for Railway Studies. The work Colin Duval, of course, did so much work on. So yes, I would hope that actually looking outwards and thinking about what is that industrial legacy in the city and how do we capture and harness and speak to that in, the new revolutions, digital technology revolutions that Damien and colleagues here are pioneering. How do we get those to speak to each other? I think that's really interesting. The Quaker legacy, oh my goodness, yes, you can imagine. I had a whole section initially on the Tukes, and I think the two things there, firstly, of course, we are all thinking about decolonising the curriculum at the moment. I think actually, you can imagine I had a very long and fruitful discussion with Mary about Alcuin, and she would say that Alcuin's at the heart of everything. If we just read more Alcuin and looked at Alcuin, we'd solve all of our problems. But what a remarkable legacy for this city he created, and that valuing of collections, but also the generosity, Alcuin's belief in how you taught and opened up the fact that it's a cathedral, not a monastic school. So interesting. In terms of the Quakers themselves, I think we have that legacy both in terms of problematizing the chocolate industry and where that all came from. We could look, I think there very interestingly, to Wilberforce, the legacy at King's Manor of the Memorial School for the Blind, what was founded in his name, colleagues' work in 18th century studies around slavery, John Finch's work, for example, on country houses and problematising their legacy in the region, working very productively with them. But also I think the Tukes have that amazing legacy. Again, many students, colleagues here have worked on their legacy for mental health and the retreat. And so I think we can happily balance problematic legacies with actually one of the most important stories about an understanding of well-being and care in the city, the retreat on one hand and, of course, Bootham Asylum on the other. We have those stories too, and that speaks, of course, to research across the arts and humanities and social sciences as well. So thank you, Joanna. I should have put both of those in, but they're there now, thanks to your question.